And can I now please welcome the one and only, the Right Honourable Jeremy Corbyn MP. Oh, Jeremy Corbyn. Oh, Jeremy Corbyn. Oh, Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, thank you, Birmingham. Thank you for a fantastic rally. Thank you. Put your hands together for all the volunteers that helped to put this event together. Because events like this don't happen by magic. They happen because of a determination of very committed volunteers to make sure they do happen. And over the next 6 weeks, I'll be travelling along with my colleagues all over the country, doing meetings like this, but above all discussion meetings as well, about the form our party will take, the democracy our party will have, the responsibility our party will have, and the inclusion our party will have from people of all communities and all faiths and none in this country, because we are going to be the grassroots voice of ordinary people. So I want to say thank you to all those that organised this event, and thank you to my colleagues in the Independent Alliance group of MPs. As Ayub said, we all came together after the 2024 election. Well, actually, they all came together around a pot of tea in my office to have a discussion about the future. And we decided we got along very well. So I want to say a thank you, first of all, to Ayub for the wonderful speech he's just made now, and that great time we had on the picket line with the Birmingham bin strikers, because they deserve our support. And thank you to Adnan Hussain, MP for Blackburn, for all the work he does in representing his constituency and our movement. The work done by Shaukat Adam, the MP for Leicester South, for the work he does, and we had some fantastic events there. Thank you to Zara Sultana, who joined our group when she left the Labour Party. And thank you also to Iqbal Mohammed, the MP for Batley and Dewsbury, for the work he does, and also his deft choice of seating in the House of Commons. I don't know how he does it, but he always manages to position himself just behind Nigel Farage. And he's quite clever at it, so as soon as Farage says something that seems to be inaccurate, perhaps motivated by bad thoughts, Iqbal says, just in a sort of normal voice, but it's picked up by the loudspeakers, "That's a lie." "That's another lie." And that's the third lie. Wonderful. So it's a team that's working together to try and ensure that the government is held to account, but above all, it's the voice of ordinary people that's held to account. Do you know what? Before we were elected to Parliament last July, we didn't really know each other. First time we came together. And yes, do we ever have differences of opinion? Sure, people do. But they don't have to fall out about it. You can talk it through and decide what the important things are. The important things are justice, inequality, poverty, war, peace. Social justice is what motivates us and brings us together. So if you think of all of you here this afternoon, what's brought you here this afternoon? It must be, I think, because you are utterly fed up with living in the fifth richest country in the world, with the largest number of children living in poverty of almost anywhere in Europe, with the greatest levels of inequality in our society, billionaires avoiding tax, and the poorest people not getting the support they need and having to survive in food banks. Over 1 million people accessing food banks. That is not right in 21st century Britain. And a health service that we are all proud, absolutely proud, of the principle of the National Health Service. A health service free at the point of need for everybody. It was what my parents' generation fought for and achieved in that great post-war settlement of bringing about council housing, proper town planning, and the National Health Service and universal free education. But our National Health Service is no longer universal, it's no longer free, because the universality of it has been taken away by the rationing of operations and the rationing of some medicines. Many people have to pay for things they used to get automatically on the NHS. And the NHS has become a vehicle for transferring vast sums of public money into the private sector by paying for operations in private hospitals, by privatising and opting out services into the private sector. There's plenty of people making a lot of money out of the NHS. I fought the last general election and the 2017 and 19 general elections on the principle of bringing the NHS totally back into public ownership without privatisation. And without a two-tier workforce, one working for the NHS, the other working for private companies. And so it's that motivates me in politics all the time, the principles of access to health, of access to housing. But just look at the housing issues facing this country. The government says it wants to build 1 million homes. Over what period, I'm unsure, because it keeps changing. But they don't say exactly what these homes are or where they're going to be built or who's going to get them. It seems to me that the infrastructure law they put through is much more about making life easier for property developers rather than a solution to the housing crisis of overcrowding, homelessness, that so many people all over the country face. Children growing up in grotesquely overcrowded, often damp flats are not likely to achieve very well in school for fairly obvious reasons. They've not even got the space at home to do their homework, never mind wanting to grow up in a normal environment. And during the COVID lockdown, when Boris Johnson grandly informed me that people could just stay at home and enjoy themselves, that's what he told me in a meeting. I said, I was very respectful. I said, Prime Minister, what do you think it's like living in a 2-bedroom council flat with 3 other siblings and your parents? What space have you got to play on your computer? What garden have you got to go out and play in? What opportunity have you got for all the social activities that you grew up with? None. It's the level of inequality and poverty in our society that has to be challenged, has to be conquered, and you do that by public investment, you do that by building council housing, you do that by decent, good quality housing for all. But since 2010, after the financial crisis then, what happened after that financial crisis? The banks, yes, the banks, remember them? They did really well. First of all, they flattened the economy, then they had lots of money given to them to keep themselves going, and they all came out of it okay. Every local authority was thumped, the health service was thumped, the education service was thumped, wages were frozen, living standards fell, and they have fallen ever since 2010 in general for working class communities all over the country. We are still living in austerity 2.0. The way forward surely ought to be challenging that and investing for the future rather than cutting for the future. And so it's what this government has failed to do that I find so astonishing. The 2024 Labour manifesto was a pretty limited, pretty thin document. With the best will in the world, you could hardly get excited about it. I mean, it was like sort of a passionate speech about nothing. And then, what's happened since then? When we were in Parliament listening to Rachel Reeves give the budget, she did some interesting things. She says, first of all, we're going to increase defence expenditure by up to £13 billion a year more. And we're going to make this country the defence industry centre of the whole world, spending more and more money on investment in armaments and research that goes with them. Then goes on to say, along with Liz Campbell, the DWP secretary, that all this had to be paid for, so they were going to take, wait for it, £5 billion out of personal independence payments for people who desperately need them. And they would refuse to end the two-child benefit cap, which keeps large families in desperate poverty. You see them at the food bank trying to survive because they get no support for the third, fourth or fifth children, depending on how large that family is. And then they tried to take away the winter fuel allowance for older people as well. So that is their sense of priorities. Their sense of priorities is to cut the living standards of the very poorest and most vulnerable people in the country. After the PIP cut was announced, I, through my local forum, I have a forum every month in my constituency, called a meeting to discuss the DWP cut, the PIP cut. And we organised it jointly with Disability Action Islington, local disability rights campaign. And they came, and people described what their life would be like if they didn't get the personal independence payment. How would they feed themselves? How would they go to the bathroom? How would they live? And it was like sort of going back 30 years, 40 years on the whole idea that people with disabilities had no rights, were invisible and just had to suffer. Many of us fought for the idea of personal independence payments, the right to be able to live a decent life and be supported because of a disability, and that was all to be taken away. Well, people fought back against it. The government then tried to say, well, we won't take it away from anybody who gets it now, but we'll take it away from the next tranche of claimants. In other words, kick the can down the road. Eventually they backed off on that because of the pressure they were put under. And we're then in a position now where the Timms review is taking place. The Timms review is taking place, which is meant to be looking at the future of personal independence payments. Well, I don't think there should be any Timms review. I think there should be an examination into the living standards of people with disabilities, led by people with disabilities who themselves can make the recommendation. So that there's a degree of democracy in the doing of that. And so it is the priorities that this government has chosen that are so wrong. And apparently Rachel Reeves is now being invited to ditch all the manifesto commitments they made a year ago. Well, I didn't know there were any more to ditch, actually, but apparently there are somewhere. Well, we need a different voice and we need an alternative, and that's where we come in. Because you look at the issues that are facing Birmingham and the West Midlands at the moment. I quite rightly mentioned the Birmingham bin strike. It is a strike because bin workers have been told to accept a cut in their wages because the council has failed to deal with the issue of equal pay. Well, two things here. One is equal pay is a legal requirement, a legal right. Many of us fought for the right of equal pay for work of equal value for women and men wherever they are in any industry or any job. That's an important principle. But it was never meant to be achieved by reducing somebody else's wages. And that is exactly what Birmingham City Council are trying to do, hence this mammoth, very long strike that's going on. And Ive and I spent the morning going around the picket lines giving support to those people there. And I thank Birmingham Trades Council for the support they've given, great speech that's made today in support of them. And I urge you all to remember that if they're allowed to get away with cutting the wages of Birmingham bin workers, how many other cities all over the country are going to decide they too can cut wages in order to get away with it? There has to be a determination that we win that dispute and we get decent pay for all people and we don't face wage cuts for those that are absolutely essential workers. And then you look at the issue faced by JLR JLR workers at the present time. The government rather belatedly decided it would support the supply chain because of the attacks made on JLR and inability to continue manufacturing. That to me indicates a government that could and should have done a lot much earlier in this. We need an industrial strategy that protects existing jobs, develops industries and invests in the sustainable industries of the future. But I'm appalled the way the government is continually trying to shy away from the whole issue of sustainability and net zero by 2030. So those are issues that are actually very important to our lives and our society. And then you look at issues that I think have to be addressed. And I'm hoping that yourparty.uk will be imaginative, inclusive, and use the expertise of all our supporters. There's hundreds of thousands of people with a lot of great knowledge and great ideas who can tell us, for example, how we can change and improve the education service in our society. I support teachers. I obviously support the whole principle of free education, but the costs that families do have to incur on preschool education because there's insufficiency of supply, the overcrowding that many children face in some of our primary schools, the stress of over-testing in both primary and secondary schools and the streaming that goes with it, has a very bad impact on children's well-being, and then the costs of college and university education. I don't see why, as a society, we punish people for going to university. I'm proud of people that want to go to university, can benefit from it, and we can all benefit from it, get in there and get a good degree. Great. That's what we want for everybody. And I remember when Blair and the government decided that they wanted to deal with what they called the funding crisis in university education by bringing in university tuition fees of £1,000 a year. I remember the Labour whips coming to me and saying, "You're going to vote against this, aren't you?" I said, "How did you guess?" How on earth did you guess? What intelligence you must have to know that? So I said, "Well, I'm glad to confirm your suspicion. Yes, I absolutely am going to." They said, "Don't you understand that this is nothing really?" What? They said, "No, this is nothing really." He said, "Just don't worry about it." I said, "Worry about what?" I said, "Look, it's only £1,000 a year. Nobody's going to notice it, and it'll never go up." I said, "Do you think I was born yesterday? This is nonsense. You know damn well that what you're doing is going away from the traditional Labour principle of universal access to benefits, education, health and housing in our society. You are walking away from them. And so far from sticking at 1,000, then 3,000, it went up to 9,000. And for overseas students, it is even more than that. And then the lack of sufficient maintenance allowance means that many students work really hard coming out of university with debts not that far off £100,000. Why are we punishing people like this? Because if somebody qualifies to be a brilliant engineer, lawyer, teacher, many things, we all benefit. We all benefit from a good doctor. We all benefit from a good engineer. We all as a society benefit from it. All we're doing is punishing people for trying to achieve something that, yes, benefits them, but also benefits society as a whole. And so what I want in yourparty.uk is some serious work done by our many brilliant friends and supporters on how we can develop the kind of education service that we started to set out in the manifestos of 17 and 19, which was a national education service which brought democracy and accountability to the heart of the education system, not the profitability of the academy groups and what they're making out of it, and not the asset stripping of the physical resources of our education service. Let's put education and the democracy of it at the heart of our lives, not as an add-on to it. Because to me, education is that important and that key. And there is so much else that we need to be working on and campaigning on, and that is what we're about. But, you know, communities that are up against it, they've seen school closures, they've seen hospital cutbacks, they've seen frozen wages, they've seen losses in public services, they've seen worse and worse delivery of public services. And they are angry, they often feel forgotten, they often feel totally ignored. And if you live in a town that once had a proud manufacturing industry centre, which is now gone, then the raison d'etre, the whole point of that town or city, has damaged or disappeared as a result of it. You see it in the former mining towns, you see it in former manufacturing industry towns, particularly in the north of England. You see it a lot. And it's the same phenomena in France and Germany and Spain and Portugal and so on. That anger then is not necessarily turned in a positive direction. Nigel Farage and the far right, Le Pen in France, Dirk Wilders in the Netherlands, and so on. There's a whole litany of these people all across Europe. Then turn up and say, somehow or other, your problems are all the fault of refugees trying to enter this country and trying to survive. And you then get the other aspect of it, which is the horror story of people of the far right turning up outside an asylum seekers' hotel, attacking it, even trying, in some cases, to burn them down. What has happened to our humanity that somehow or other, this illogical thinking, that these people who are fleeing often from war, violence, environmental disaster and human rights abuses, some of which we have been involved in Afghanistan and Iraq, are somehow or other the cause of these problems. Insufficient investment in all the services I've mentioned, low wages which I've mentioned, poverty I've mentioned, are not caused by those people. They're caused by a taxation system that rewards the wealthy, allows the rich to become super rich, allows the super rich to become planetary billionaires, and at the same time the rest of the population has to endure worse and worse services and a worse and worse quality of life as a result of it. What we need is transformation politics that brings people together rather than divides them apart. And that means we stand up against the racists in any form in our society. The horrible event that happened at the synagogue in Manchester has to be absolutely and totally condemned. There is no place for anti-Semitism in our society of any sort. There is no place for Islamophobia in our society in any form. And so those people that tried to burn down the mosque in East Sussex need to think again. There are millions of us in this country that will not accept or allow any form of racism within our society. Yesterday was the anniversary of the 1936 Cable Street uprising, when the people of East London stood together to oppose the march of the fascists through the East End. Jewish and Irish communities stood together to oppose the march of the fascism. How do I know about that? Because my mum told me about it, because she was there at the time. Because we have to remember that sometimes you do have to confront the far right, but just confronting them is not the whole story. There has to be a political narrative of an alternative that brings communities and people together and strengthens our society and does not weaken it. And because we live in a world where there are grotesque examples of wars around the world, people I've met in Calais who had been in Afghanistan during the war, then the Taliban took over and they suddenly had no friends and no ability to survive. So they fled to try and get to a place of safety. Are they our enemies? No. They're people doing what any of us would do, trying to get somewhere safe in order to survive. So let's have some humanity about how we deal with this. And then you look at the unbelievable horror of what is happening in Gaza, and for that matter, in the West Bank too. I've been in Palestine in my life on 9 different occasions. Every time I've been there, it's been worse than the time before. And every time you're there, you're just impressed with the stoicism of the Palestinian people in just trying to survive. But what have we had? 60,000 recorded deaths in Gaza. And through the Peace and Justice Project, we did a tribunal, a Gaza tribunal, and the estimate is that there's that number again and more whose bodies are lying under rubble. We're then seeing in real time, in real life, children being operated on by very skilled and brilliant and humanitarian surgeons with no antiseptic, no anaesthetic, insufficiency of equipment. And some of those children survive, some die of the pain or heart attacks brought about by the pain, or die of starvation because there's no food to give them to get over the operation. And that's happening real time on our television. Within probably 20 kilometres away, there's all the food, there's all the water, there's all the medicine, there's all the energy, there's everything everyone needs to survive. And so there is something quite evil in a world that does that. And then you ask yourself the question, why is this happening and how is it being allowed to happen? So last week I was in South Africa to thank the government of South Africa and the government of Namibia for having the courage to take the case of genocide to the International Court of Justice. And a country that had thrown off the yoke of apartheid felt strong enough and able enough to do that. And so they took the case to the International Court of Justice. And if there's a real comrade here, they'll bring me some water. Behind Ireland, a bit early for the pantomime season, but there we are. Thank you. And so that case was brought to the ICJ, and the ICJ has given an opinion that acts of genocide could well be taking place. Others have come to a very similar conclusion, as has the International Criminal Court. But still, the siege of Gaza goes on. Still, the lack of food, lack of water, lack of medicine, and everything else has happened. And so, what we should do, yes, coming to that, but what we should also do is say a big thank you to all those brave people that went on the flotilla to try and deliver food and medicine and water. To the people of Gaza. And then ask yourself the next question, this is the harder one. Why has Britain continued to supply arms to Israel and continued to allow the Royal Air Force bases in Cyprus to be used as staging point for weapons delivery? Why is 15% of the component parts of the F-35 jet be made in this country and continue to be made in this country? So our group in Parliament, we organise very carefully every week, week in, week out, demanding an end to arms supplies, pointing out what's going on, the human rights abuses that the occupation has brought about, and also about the issue of the occupation of the West Bank and the attempt by the Israeli far right to annex the whole of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as well. And so if there's to be peace, it has to start with the idea of the withdrawal of Israel from Palestine altogether. And that we have to be demanding. So the Trump plan, which is based on the idea of the sort of Gaza Riviera plan, and then the idea that Tony Blair would be there to sort it out and make sure it works. I mean, I've had my differences with Tony Blair over the years, but I can't quite see the idea of Viceroy Blair going into Gaza to sort it out. This is colonial nonsense that belongs in the century before last. It doesn't need Tony Blair to tell the people of Gaza how to rebuild their homes. It doesn't need Tony Blair to tell them how to run their education and health service. The people of Gaza are actually the most qualified and most skilled people in the whole world, bar none. What they need is an end to the military occupation. But as with all conflicts, there is something that is very unpleasant about it, because if you follow much of the mainstream media, there's a constant denigration of the culture, the history, the values, the music, the art, the poetry of Palestine. And that's what wars do. They try to dehumanize the other side in it. And so it's very important to do a number of things. One is recognize Palestinian values and culture, and 2, to be there on the streets demonstrating about it. Today, we've just sent out several 100,000 emails to all our friends all over the country in a very strongly worded message saying, next Saturday, October the 11th, be in London for the largest ever demonstration in support of the Palestinian people. And we're expecting a huge turnout for that. Conflict inspires people in many ways. The First World War, the most brutal and first industrial war of the 20th century, inspired great poets and great writing. Don't think there aren't great poets being produced in Palestine at the moment. I want to read what Rifat Alira wrote before he was killed by the Israeli forces. If I must die, if I must die, you must live, to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings. Make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope, let it be a story. Tragically, the horror story of the Palestinian people is not the only conflict going on in the world at the moment. There's the horror story of the war between Russia and Ukraine, which needs a ceasefire and needs pulling back and needs to bring about peace for the people of Russia and the Ukraine. It needs a process that brings about peace for the people of Sudan, not the pouring of weapons into the conflict in Sudan that is doing so much damage to so many people. It needs a different approach in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the mineral companies are making millions of pounds out of the work of the militias there. It needs a different approach. So the reason I say all this is because we are doing something special and different here. I've spent my life in the Labour Party, and as you know, I had some differences with the leadership that took over after me. Well, no, I didn't have differences. They had differences with me, whichever way you want to put it, I don't mind. It's not the point. The point is that we were removed from the party, and party membership went from 600,000 down to less than 200,000 because people saw no inspiration, saw no hope, and didn't see anything particularly radical in the manifesto that was being put forward. And in the last election, the Labour vote was even lower than it was in 2019 and lower than it was in a lot of other elections before that. We just have a very strange electoral system that then produces the biggest ever parliamentary majority. So without consulting my colleagues, I tell you this, the one thing we want to do in Parliament is change the electoral system and bring in a form of proportional representation. And it is now how we organise our party. Political parties can become brutal places, they can become sources of power trips and forces for narcissism amongst individuals. They all suffer from it. Or they can be democratic and totally rooted in the community. What I'm looking for in yourparty.uk is local organisation, local assemblies, locally accountable to the community, where your party is seen to be part of the community all the time, on the good days and the bad, when you're fighting to defend a hospital, when you're fighting to expand a nursery, when you're trying to bring greater road safety, when you're trying to support people who are vulnerable, when you're bringing people together. That will be our strength. We will be there in the community all over the country. And that is where the accountability comes in, and that's where the importance of bringing a huge range of people with different kinds of ideas to come in, and we can develop very strong policies. At the moment, we've set out the generality of them, which is 1, economic justice and social equality within our society; 2, public ownership of crucial services like water, electricity and mail; thirdly, it is about environmental sustainability, so we don't walk away from net zero by 2030, but we recognise there are limits to the damage we can do to the natural world. We have to survive within it. That means more creative thinking. It doesn't mean walking away and allowing Donald Trump to decide you're going to drill, burn or whatever he wants to do. Instead, you look to ways of doing things in a sustainable way. And on the global stage, we become the voice for peace. And so we will then be the alternative to what the far right are offering, the alternative to the way in which conservative parties have conceded ground to the far right, and the way in which social democrat and socialist parties all over Europe have conceded ground by using the most appalling language against refugees, against asylum seekers and against migrants, and always failing to recognise that without those millions of people that have made their homes in this country, there would be no health service, there would be no education service, there would be no transport service. We absolutely depend on these people. And so I want our party to also be that creative function within our society, where we are a centre for art, for music, for ideas, for literature, for culture, as well as for science and engineering and all the other things, that our children go to school and are given the opportunity of creative education, as well as the obviously more academic subjects that they need to study. So we grow up a society that is inclusive, that is respectful and understanding of each other. This is a moment. This is a moment where we can actually change politics in this country. We can be an example to others around the world of how we give people hope rather than desperation, that we give people opportunity rather than despair. We give young people the opportunity to grow up into a world that we have made fit for them, the next generation. So yourparty.uk is on the way, growing, and we're going to win it. Thank you very much indeed.
Shall I lie down, yeah? Hold it,